Welcome to the Lighthouse Freedom Podcast. On this episode, we are talking about ego and how ego is the enemy and how to get control of your ego and use it for you and not let it be used against you. Can't wait to dive in. Welcome back to the Lighthouse Freedom Podcast. We just had to throw the headset on and the mics in because Calvin, we just started going off about just figuring things out along the way and just taking the leap and building the plane on the way down. And Houston and I are just riffing. Are we rolling now? All right, we can leave this in there.
We are
just
rolling.
Authentic.
It's about not knowing what you're doing, but there's always going to be a point in anything in life when you don't know what you're doing.
Yeah.
Right. So it's like you have a choice. You can either just continue to say, I don't really know what the hell I'm doing and not do it. Or you can just dive in, go and figure it out. But there's scary times, right? But like that's where the magic happens. It truly is. Like it sounds like such a cliche, but that's the magic.
And your there's a Steve Harvey quote, and he tells a story about taking the jump, and then your parachute will open.
Yeah,
and you'll hit some rocks and stuff. He talks about standing on the cliff of life, you stand on the edge of life, and 98% of people will never jump, and they won't jump because they want their parachute to open before they jump.
Before they go.
And that's not how it works.
Yeah.
You got to jump and then trust that your parachute will open. And that leap, 98% of people won't make it.
Yeah.
And when you do leap, your parachute doesn't open right away. So that's that uncertainty you're talking about. And we talked about it earlier in some earlier episodes of just like the work comes before the belief. When you leap, like you're going to probably like hit the side of the mountain, bounce off, and like you're going to get scratched and go through some stuff. But eventually the parachute will open, right? Because it's as long as you're a good person, right? And you are continuing to put in the consistent effort, like the parachute will open because that is the law of the universe. Like eventually you will get there as long as you learn from your mistakes, you call audibles, make adjustments, and you have integrity and you continue to operate and take consistent action. Yeah. The parachute will open and you'll soar. Yeah. But so many people, man, they stand on the edge and they see everybody flying around with their parachutes open and they're just waiting for theirs to pop. And it's like, well, that ain't how it works.
Sitting, waiting on it to happen.
Yeah. And the episode that we're in right now, the title is, ego is the enemy. And I think kind of segueing into that topic is what's holding a lot of people back is not being willing to be bad at something, not being willing to fail. It's not being willing to like potentially look stupid because of what other people may think, because of what the world might tell you, right, is failure and it's bad, right? It comes back to those potential beliefs that are ingrained in you. But at the end of the day, people's egos are holding them back tremendously. And that's a very difficult thing to put in check. Because it requires, like we talked about, a lot of self-awareness to maintain that.
Yeah.
So.
I think the ego, the ego it can hold you back from starting, right? Because at the base level, the ego is there to protect you, right? So it's a hard thing to really understand, but it can not only hold you back from starting and beginning and taking that leap. We're talking with Calvin before getting into this episode about his leap. I mean, he took a huge leap of faith. And Calvin, I hope you don't mind me sharing this, but just driving out, drove out from out west and came to Nashville, landed and networked his way into what is now an awesome life journey for him and career and meeting new people and all of this stuff. But to your point, Chad, if you're afraid of that failure, you're afraid of that setback, what that truly is ego. And you have to just learn when to let that go and when your ego can serve you. Right?
When can it serve you?
So I'm a competitive guy. You're a competitive guy. Most of the people within our circle, the poker night guys, they're all very competitive. And so I find that when I'm challenged in something, my ego will typically take over and like drive me towards whatever that is. I can't stand it. This has also not served me when it's taken to the extreme, but I cannot stand being told that I can't do something. Yeah, it doesn't matter if it's physical, if it's mental, it doesn't matter. When challenged with something, I can use my ego to drive me to whatever that is. And it will drive me to make sure that even if I don't achieve whatever it is, I'm going to give it my fucking all. Like I'm going to die.
Yeah.
rather than have someone say, well, yeah, you didn't try it.
Yeah.
You didn't go for it. And so in those times, like the ego can serve me just to push me forward. But that's a balance, right? Like you can get into a very fine line, because your ego can also, can keep you tied to something that you're no longer supposed to be doing, right? In business and relationships and different areas of life, your ego, because you're into something, so you're invested in it. You're invested in Titan Capital. You're invested in, a biologics company like I am. And well, if things start to change so much so that, the culture changes and it just becomes glaringly obvious that like, this is no longer for you. This may have been a chapter and you need to move on. Like business starts going bad, or, you have something within relationships that, like Shannon and I have like non-negotiables within the relationship, and those are clearly stated. We understand them. Same thing in business, right? So I guess to kind of tie this in, when the ego gets in the way of making a decision to end that relationship or to end that business partnership or to pivot away from a business that no longer serves you or your family, the ego can hold you to that for way too long, and you'll just encounter a lot of suffering that you really don't need to encounter.
Yeah, 100%. As you were talking, I wrote down pivot, and then you said it, right?
Yeah.
So it can prevent the willingness to pivot, because now your ego is so attached to this thing that you've been doing, right? And it turns out that thing may not be in the right, but your ego is going to hold you to that, and now you're unwilling to pivot, and then thus holding yourself back.
Yeah.
And I think what I want to elaborate on too is that competitiveness, because there is a place for ego in your life. There's a place for a little bit of cockiness, as long as it doesn't err on the side of arrogance, and there's a place for confidence, and as long as that you're not blinded by it, I think is the biggest thing. As long as the ego doesn't take over and then drive emotional decisions to be made because they're being made out of a place of an egocentric decision-making process.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, the dichotomy of controlling your ego, having it, but having it under control. I think is the trickiest part of all because we all have one. But do you control it, or does it control you? Because the majority of people are controlled by their ego, which is why they care what other people think, which is why they won't make the leap, right? Which is why they're attached to this identity and they're unwilling to see something from the other side, is because they're attached to that ego and they don't want to admit they're wrong. Because what would the person think if I say, you know what, I was wrong. I got duped, or I was wrong about this. I made a bad decision. And the willingness to admit that you're wrong, the willingness to admit that you failed, the willingness to pivot when something doesn't make sense. We were talking about this earlier. Like, I started 3 companies before the first one actually got traction. The fourth one actually got traction and took off. It took a lot to finally like bury each one of those and just say, fuck, this isn't working. You know, I had that 90-day rule that we were talking about. Like, I would do something hard for 90 days. Yeah. And then if it wasn't working, I was like, I got to pivot. Yeah. You know?
So did you find that there are certain questions that you would ask yourself to know, okay, here are the 3 things that I would ask myself after the post 90 days? Did you figure out through that process, like, here's what the brass tacks, here's what I need to get to know if this is for me or not?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, are you getting fulfillment doing it? Like, if you do something, far too many people aren't doing anything for long enough to understand, number 1, if it's working, number 2, if they enjoy doing it, or number 3, if they should continue doing it. So are you getting fulfillment from it? Is it profitable? Are you able to measure the results? Are the results measurable? Those kinds of questions. Is it scalable? Is it something that I want to continue to invest in? And, I think there's a lot of folks that are just like doubling and tripling and quadrupling down on something that they really don't even enjoy doing or aren't passionate about, and they're just unwilling to just toss in the towel on that venture. It doesn't mean you've quit. Like, failure is only finite if you completely quit entirely and just say, I'm done. I'm going to go sit. I'm going to go plump my ass on the beach and drink Coronas and for as long as I can, and that's it. I'm out. Yeah. But pivoting in business and shutting down a potential venture and starting something new, like that goes back to that whole failure to learn and being a student of that. Like, so every one of those businesses that shut down, like, I took some great lessons from each one of those, and then was ultimately able to apply it to the 4th business that ended up getting traction, and then ultimately took off and allowed, for a lot of things to happen. So, yeah, I mean, asking those kinds of questions, and do I need to give this more time? Like there was one that I think I stretched out for a little bit longer because it was like, I don't know, but do something hard for 90 days and then pick your head up and look at the results and look at the body of work. But put your head down and work.
Yeah.
Most people don't want to do that. They don't want to like, this is what I'm going to do. And I'm going to do it for 90 days, every day, hard.
Yeah.
And then you pick your head up.
Yeah.
People are doing this, trying things out, and they're just like dabbling, dabble for a couple of weeks. Hey, I'm going to get into trading, and they take a course by the legendary Jeremy Newsom, and they, do it for a couple of days, and they're like, yeah, this isn't for me.
I'm not winning. I don't have enough in the P&L.
Yeah,
column.
this isn't for me.
Yeah.
And that's, maybe it's not, but you didn't do it long enough to know. And then that's just a testament to how you're doing everything else in your life, because how you do one thing is how you do everything.
Yeah.
So if you're just dipping your toe in a bunch of different buckets, you're never going to really excel in anything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think you can prolong that whole cycle for yourself in doing that. Meaning if you're just going to kind of tiptoe in it, like you said, joking or not, with Jeremy Newsom's program, real life trading, like if you're going to dabble in it, stick your toe in the water, and then after 60 days, say, I don't have the results I was expecting, or, whether it's a venture or, a business partnership where you're trying something new, but you didn't really go all in, then you're never going to know. And it's like a false sense of failure, if you want to call it that. It's like, well, I tried that and it didn't work, so I moved on to this. People do in fitness all the time too.
Yeah.
We talked about it earlier. Like, yeah, I've been eating salads and I don't have a six pack yet, and it's been 2 days. Yep. Right. And then, like you said, there's a story. There's a, someone asked Bedros Keuilian this question. It echoes in my head all the time. And that's, what do you think is the number one thing that holds people back? And his answer is simple, but powerful. And it's their story, right? There's always a story as to why you can't do something or why you failed. And typically that begins with a lot of finger pointing, towards other people and other, you point that compass towards circumstances and things like that. And you're smiling. So something obviously hit home, but
it's funny because I have just a little notepad because I have ideas that pop in my head. I don't want to forget them because I'm trying to actively listen and just focus on what you're saying. So I jot words down and I write the word down, and then you say it like exactly what I'm going to elaborate on. And what you're talking about is the victim mentality. When you talk about the stories we tell ourselves, why we gave up something, then people come up with this story, and it's the reason why they couldn't.
Yeah.
And the reason people have so many stories is because right now in this time, this exact moment in time, society rewards the victim mentality. It's who has the most victim story, and that is what's getting all the likes and the thumbs and the hearts. It's not the stories of the grit and the people who persevered. Right now, success is villainized and victimhood is admired.
That's so true.
Oh, and we talked about the culture problem, in the country right now. And that's, I think, one of the biggest ones is that, that victimization.
Yeah.
Everybody wants to be the biggest victim.
Yeah.
Everybody's got a fucking story about why they couldn't do it, who's up against them, why it's not them. And then they put that victim story on social media, and that's what gets the thumbs. And then it's a self-perpetuating thing because then they just continue to tell that story. And what happens is they just go down that rabbit hole of being a victim, so much so that becomes their identity.
Yeah.
And it becomes the reason that they don't ever grow or shake that shell or become the butterfly from the caterpillar, is because they're just stuck in that story that they've told themselves and that they've told others.
Man, and it becomes so deeply seated in them, that victim mentality, the victim story, that, that becomes all they know. They become comfortable in that story. And it's so sad, man, because it's easy. And then you see people just get, again, I say stuck, but you get stuck in that story, and you suffer from it as an individual. You suffer, your family suffers because of it. And it's all for naught if people would just wake up to the fact that it doesn't need to be that way. But you make a good point, and that's society. They really they put that victim mentality, that victim story almost on a pedestal, like it's admired. And, you have people kind of like swapping, playing swords with like who had the hardest upbringing or who, you know, we talk about failures and
Yeah.
and things not working all the time because it's part of the process, it's part of the journey. But it's almost like people want to admire how hard someone had it, or you know, the depth of despair that they went through for whatever it is. And it's like, that's great, but like, do you want to live and exist there?
Yep.
Do you want to stay there?
Yep.
And the fact that, I think it's something to really look at and pay attention to, the way it's portrayed on social media, because it's like, look at me, this is my upbringing and this is how hard I have it. And it's a victim story. It's a victim mentality, and it's an addiction. People would just get stuck there.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's sad.
There's just a quick story. There's a guy that I know who, I knew a long, long time ago. When I like first got into real estate and I was living in South Florida, and, he had this story, and some guy had screwed him over in business like many years before. And he kept telling that story, and that's why he wasn't winning. Like, and I just knew who he was. And, he just, every time anything happened, he would just relate back to that story of like, he got shafted that one time he got shafted, you know, and that was the reason he was at where he's at. And what he didn't realize was every time he told that story was the reason he was exactly where he was, because he kept telling that story. And I heard him, it was a guy that was working in an office that I was in, and I heard him tell that story to multiple people. I'm like, dude, every time you tell that story, you're breathing life into it, and then that is becoming your identity.
Yeah, it perpetuates, and you're just going to continue the same cycle over and over.
Yeah, and we were talking about this over lunch, where we were talking about when you choose to look at life as happening for you and not to you, and had he chosen to look at that situation as having happened for him, his whole life would be different than it is right now.
Yeah.
But instead, it happened to him, and that promotes the victim, because once it happens to you, like now it's outside of your control, and then the response is outside of your control because it's an external thing that happened to you. But even when shitty things happen, even in our business, and I'm sure you're the same way, deal goes south, fucking something happens, supply chain issue, you can't deliver the product, we can't close on time, some shit happens, it's outside of our control. I always think, all right, this is happening for me. It's just about seeing how.
Yeah.
How is this happening for me? You know, and that takes you, when you think about it that way, and then you have gratitude at the same time, you completely eliminate the victim mentality from your life 100% in totality. You will never be a victim when you think life happens for you and you're grateful for everything in your life. You can't be a victim.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Reframe the story.